All right, my dudes, we're working on a 1999 GMC Sierra 1500 four-wheel drive. We're going to be doing some inner tie rods and a rear U-joint. Has tons of play. I can just move this U-joint and you can hear it clicking. We're going to take these two end caps off on both sides. Then we should be able to tap lightly right here and get that to break free from the yoke. Maybe use a pry bar, whatever you gotta do. And you might lose some transmission fluid from the end of the tail shaft of the transfer case there. I'm not sure on this one. So I'm gonna put oil pan underneath just in case. Let's get these tires off and drive shaft out. All right, we're gonna start with the inner tie rods. If you're just interested in the U-joint, skip ahead in the video. I wire wheeled this whole thing because it's just covered with mud and grease. So I wire wheeled there, top of the outer tie rod because they're going to reuse it. I recommended changing them, but she's broke. Can only afford these inner tie rods that are horrible. Wire wheeled that. Lug nuts were 7/8 or 22 mil. 18 millimeter on this outer tie rod nut. So we're just gonna zip that off. Here we go. If you want these tie rods to come off easy, there's a spot you hit right. My camera's not focusing. There we go. Hit right there on the steering knuckle here. And it should pop off. So you gotta hit a little harder than that. I can't hit hard enough with one hand, so give me a second. All right, I gave it a little heavier love tap and it broke free from its tapered joint. Came right out. Now this inner tie rod, if you pull back and forth, it's moving quite a bit. Now I'm gonna put this back in its home. And we're gonna loosen the lock nut on the back and see if this outer tie rod will start spinning off. All right, we're all set up here. Put the tie rod back in its home just for stability. Got my jumbo vice grips on the flat spot of the outer tie rod. You can use a wrench, crescent wrench, pipe wrench, whatever you need. And we're gonna turn this clockwise to make the nut back off. That's a 7/8 wrench on that nut there. All right, that lock nut right there didn't want to come off. I gave it a little bit of heat and broke free. Now I'm going to count how many turns my outer tie rod came off. All right, I might not have needed heat on that lock nut. I could have probably used a bar, but heat's just so much easier. I got the inner tie rod out. Behind the boot, there's a big nut on these inner tie rods. It's, I believe, 1 5/16, maybe 1 1/2. Make sure you clean up your grease cert. That way you can grease it when the job's over. And I just used a big crescent on that nut on the back. There's a big nut in both of them. I verified that the inner tie rods are both the same total length. It doesn't look like it looking through the camera, but they are. So the 21 spins I took off the outer tie rod. I'm gonna put 21 spins back on the new inner tie rod when I put the outer tie rod on it. And that should set us right back in the same spot for alignment. So we're gonna put a little bit of thread locker on this new one right here on the ends of these threads and get it tightened on there. All right, I spun that lock nut back, tightened up my outer tie rod 21 turns, tightened up that nut on the back with my big crescent. Nice and tight. After it was 21 turns on, turn this lock nut to your left, tighten it down, nut back on the tie rod. The nut didn't want to tighten up. That happens sometimes. The ball joint is spinning inside the outer tie rod. You could put a 10 millimeter on this and hit an 18 wrench on the nut, and that'll tighten it up. So grease up your two fittings, inner and outer, put the tire back on. I'll do the other side, then we'll move on to the U-joint. These inner tie rods, the alignment was towed out very noticeably. Whoever put the last inner outer tie rods on didn't know what they were doing. So I adjusted it by loosening the lock nut and then putting a 1/2-inch wrench on the inner tie rod slot here and tightening. I drew the outer tie rod in, and visually it looks good. I'll take a measurement, but that's how you adjust your alignment, your toe in, toe out, is loosen the big lock nut and turn the inner tie rod. I did it on both sides, got the steering wheel back to straight. All right, I got my U-joint caps off. There she is. I'm gonna give her a light tap here, maybe use a try to use a pry bar because they're rusted in there pretty good, and get this to break free, the U-joint from the yoke. All right, we got the drive shaft out. Once it breaks free from the yoke, you just slide it out from the transfer case. You can clean that up a little bit, put a little grease on it before I reinstall it. We're just doing this rear U-joint, so we're gonna start off with getting these clips out on both sides. I've got those clips out. I set up my ball joint press / U-joint press here. You can see that the top leaves plenty of room for the top cap to press through. You can use a bench vise or a shop press to do this. It's just by myself, huge drive shaft like this. It's hard to hold her still using the shop press. So I'm going to use this method. I'm going to tighten that down. All right, so I tightened it down and I pressed this lower up. And you want to get right to the point that it doesn't gouge into the aluminum right there. Now I'm going to take this press off. All right, press off. This bearing cap, a lot of times you got to put vice grips or something on it and get it to spin, and then it pulls out. Now we're going to set up the press to press this bearing cap down through there. I've taken a 3/4 socket, placed it on top. It fits in there pretty nicely with a little wiggle room. The bottom of it is touching the bottom of the U-joint, and gave it some hammer blows to make sure my end cap down here started in the hole straight. That's important. Now I'm going to set the press back on it. This is how I got my press set up. Still got that socket there. Made sure I was clearing the bearing cap right here at the bottom. Now I'm going to press it out. All right, got that cap through the ear. That one's in there kind of stiff, so I got to use vice grips to turn it. And it came out. I just got to finagle this out. Boom. I'm going to clean it up good. There's a bunch of crud on it. And then start putting the new U-joint in. All right, the grooves where their bearing cap clips fit in were packed full of oxidization. I took a pick, cleaned out the grooves best I could. Then I got a Dremel tool with a little wire wheel on it that fits in there good. Got them nice and cleaned out. I'm gonna put a little bit of grease in here to help the bearing caps go in. All right, I got my U-joint started in. You take the bearing caps off. There's these two with the inside clip are gonna go to the yoke. These two are the ones with the outside clips. Take the bearing caps off and put your U-joint in, and then put your caps through the end. You give them a couple of taps to get them started straight. Make sure none of those needle bearings fall out. You're not tapping too hard. Make sure it moves over nice and smooth. Now I'm just going to put it in my vise and squeeze them together real quick. All right, they squeeze together pretty easily, but we got to press them in more to get the clips in. We're going to use that 3/4 socket from earlier and put it on the outside of the vise to push it in a little bit further on each side. I pressed in one side. Make sure you don't press too far. And put the clip in. I'm going to press the other side in a little bit and get the clip on that side. Alright, got the other clip in. Give it a tap with a hammer and a flathead to make sure it's seated all the way. Now we put our other caps back on. Being careful of those needle bearings inside. This one has a special Zerk fitting. You got to have an adapter for your grease gun to grease that. Get it at any parts store. And our U-joint is installed. While you're putting this drive shaft in, just make sure you don't drop those caps that aren't pressed in there. And put it back in. That should do it. One more thing, don't forget to put your little clips on the inside. They're gonna sit inside these grooves. You put your U-joint in, and we'll put the caps back on and tighten them down, and we're all done. Thanks for watching.